Freedom has never been a gift wrapped neatly and handed down by the oppressor. Martin Luther King Jr. told us 60 years ago, it must be demanded by the oppressed. And today on African soil, those words catch fire once again. Picture this, a continent of 1.4 billion people, long forced to drive on the digital toll roads of Silicon Valley, suddenly builds a highway of its own. No more detours across the Atlantic. No more hidden fees flowing into the pockets of foreign shareholders. No more African voices buried under distant algorithms. Overnight, a new declaration shakes the world. A declaration of digital independence, as bold and as daring as any revolution of the past. But here's the paradox. In America, self-reliance is celebrated as virtue. In Europe, sovereignty is defended as sacred. Yet when leaders like Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré demand sovereignty, not only over their gold and their farms, but over their very data, they are met with suspicion, even hostility. Why? Because this fight is not about Wi-Fi speed. It is about dignity. It is about power. It is about who gets to decide the future. And so we ask, when a people build their own digital highways, are they destabilizing the world order, or finally beginning a fairer one? The internet was once promised to be a borderless space, a great commons of humanity where ideas could travel as freely as the wind. But for Africa, that promise turned out to be an illusion. For decades, every message, every payment, every search typed on a screen in Ghana, Kenya, or Burkina Faso had to make a detour of thousands of miles before reaching its destination. A student in Nairobi sending a simple email to a classmate across town would see that message routed first to Europe or the United States before looping back home. Imagine mailing a letter to your neighbor next door by shipping it across the Atlantic Ocean first. That was the daily reality for hundreds of millions of Africans. This system was not just inefficient, it was punishing. Families were forced to spend a disproportionate share of their income just to keep their children connected for school. A farmer trying to access fair market prices online was charged more than his counterparts in New York or Los Angeles, not because of a lack of demand, but because Africa was renting space on someone else's digital property. At one point, Africans were paying some of the highest internet costs in the world, while still receiving some of the slowest speeds. And behind the dollars lost was something far more dangerous. Power itself was being outsourced. The infrastructure of the digital world was designed in such a way that the keys to Africa's knowledge were held thousands of miles away. Tech giants in Silicon Valley were not just service providers. They became gatekeepers. They decided what information was easy to find, how fast it would appear, and which voices would be amplified or silenced. Consider this. A young student researching the Mali Empire might find more information about Napoleon than about her own continent's legacy. An entrepreneur in Lagos searching for solutions to local agricultural challenges would be bombarded first with American or European models before discovering African innovation buried deep in the results. Algorithms, built in offices in California and Seattle, defined what Africa could see about itself. This was not an accident. It was an architecture of dependency, a digital reflection of colonial history. Just as raw materials once flowed outward, while wealth and influence flowed inward, so too did Africa's data, ideas, and potential stream away to foreign servers. Every cable laid beneath the ocean carried not only bits and bytes, but also the power to shape narratives and control economies. In the old order, Africans were left with two choices: submit quietly to the digital empire, paying the tolls at every intersection, or risk everything to create something new. Safety and dependence, or danger and freedom. That tension now defines the era of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, and it explains why the question of internet sovereignty is not about technology alone. It is about dignity. It is about whether a continent of 1.4 billion people will remain tenants on someone else's property or finally become the architects of their own future. Let us look at the hard facts. Africa has carried some of the highest internet costs in the world, not because demand was low, not because people were unwilling to connect, but because the continent was forced to rent its digital lifelines from foreign infrastructure. A family in Burkina Faso might spend a painful share of their monthly income just to keep their children online for school. A farmer in Nigeria could lose more money on data fees than he gained from using the internet to sell his crops. This was not a failure of Africans. It was a system designed to keep them dependent. Behind those inflated costs stood the giants of Silicon Valley: Google, Amazon, Microsoft. Names that in the West are praised as innovators became in Africa something very different. They were not just providers of services, they became the toll collectors, the custodians of Africa's knowledge. Every email, every search, every digital payment carried a hidden price, and that price flowed into their pockets. And the impact was not only financial, it was intellectual, it was cultural. What Africans saw when they searched online was not a mirror of their own reality. It was a reflection filtered through distant algorithms. A young person searching for the Mali Empire could find Napoleon faster than Mansa Musa. A journalist digging into African independence might see more about European explorers than African freedom fighters. This was not simply about bandwidth. It was about identity. These facts reveal the deeper wound. Africa's voices were drowned out. Its knowledge was sidelined. Its people were charged more and shown less. And until that cycle was broken, true sovereignty was never possible. The story now sharpens into a choice, a fork in the road with consequences that reach far beyond technology. For decades, Africa was told there was only one way forward: pay the tolls, accept the delays, and live with a digital reality designed elsewhere. That was the familiar path, the so-called safe path. It meant safety and dependence. It meant signing contracts with foreign shareholders, accepting filtered knowledge, and teaching a generation of young people that their place in the digital world was at the back of the line. It was predictable, yes, but predictability came at the cost of permanent subordination. And then came a different vision, untested, uncertain, but alive with possibility. The second path meant risk and freedom. It meant refusing to rent someone else's digital house and instead building one of their own. It meant laying down over 60,000 miles of fiber optic cables, constructing 47 data centers across deserts, jungles, and cities, and designing a protocol that was deliberately incompatible with the monopolies of Silicon Valley. It meant telling Google and Microsoft that their crawlers and their clouds could no longer dictate the rules of African life. The price tag was heavy. Billions of dollars had to be mobilized. Engineers had to be trained. Governments had to coordinate across vast distances and political divides. Skeptics laughed. Analysts warned of disaster. Western lobbyists whispered into the ears of ministers, predicting collapse. But the numbers told another story. $50 billion every year had been leaving Africa to pay for foreign digital services. $50 billion that could have funded African engineers, African startups, and African innovation. That money was not an expense. It was a lifeline waiting to be reclaimed. For the farmer in Burkina Faso, the choice was not abstract. Faster and cheaper access to data could mean higher yields, better markets, and protection against exploitation. For the student in Nairobi, it meant typing a search query and finally seeing African history appear at the top of the results. For the entrepreneur in Lagos, it meant building an app that could reach millions without paying a tax to distant corporations. The escalation was clear. One path locked Africa into a future of dependence. The other path opened the gates to sovereignty, but at a cost that required courage, unity, and defiance. And standing at this crossroads, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré made their wager. They chose danger and freedom over safety and chains. At the heart of this story stands a young man, barely in his mid-30s, yet carrying the weight of a continent's hopes. Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, is not the image of the cautious statesman who waits for permission from abroad. He is the face of a generation that refuses to inherit chains disguised as contracts. His voice, steady and unshaken, has become a rallying cry across Africa. Traoré does not speak about sovereignty in abstract terms. For him, it is not just a slogan, it is a foundation. He places the internet in the same category as gold, as farmland, as water. Essential, non-negotiable, a pillar of freedom that no nation can afford to outsource. Standing before his people, he declared with simple clarity, "If we can reclaim our minds, our farms, and now our internet, then dependence ends." Those words moved like fire through the hearts of the young. They were printed on posters, shouted in rallies, and shared across social media as a new anthem of dignity. In the past, sovereignty meant controlling borders, armies, and minds. But Traore widened the definition. He reminded his people that in the 21st century, sovereignty also means who controls your cables, your servers, your data. Without digital independence, political independence is an empty shell. Without digital ownership, economic growth remains at the mercy of outsiders. What makes his message powerful is its mix of emotional truth and practical vision. He does not only speak of pride, he speaks of harvests improved by faster access to information. He speaks of students finding African voices in their search results. He speaks of engineers building careers at home instead of chasing visas abroad. And he does not flinch in naming the enemy. Not a single country, but a system. A system of foreign corporations, foreign governments, and colonial patterns that insist Africa's participation in the digital age must come with submission. Against that system, Traore's words strike like a hammer. Dependence ends the day we decide it ends. For millions of Africans, his defiance is more than politics. It is proof that leadership can be young, unapologetic, and uncompromising. It is proof that a new chapter is being written, one in which Africa does not ask permission, but claims its rightful place. The shockwaves did not stop at Africa's borders. They rippled outward, colliding with the old centers of power. In Washington, the response was swift and nervous. Analysts on Capitol Hill warned that Africa's bold step could destabilize the global internet. They called it reckless, a fragmentation of the digital order. Behind closed doors, policymakers debated whether sanctions could be justified under the banner of digital security. To them, Africa's independence was not innovation. It was a threat. In Paris, the reaction was sharper, almost personal. French officials, still haunted by the loss of influence in West Africa, accused leaders like Traoré of creating chaos. They framed Africa's digital independence as a weapon, not a right. Newspapers in Europe carried headlines predicting instability. Commentators painted visions of an internet split apart, as though sovereignty itself were a crime when practiced by Africans. Meanwhile, inside Silicon Valley, panic took a different form. Executives at Google, Microsoft, and Amazon convened emergency meetings. Their fear was not simply about losing customers. It was structural. The new African protocol was deliberately incompatible with their systems. Their crawlers could not index it. Their clouds could not penetrate it. Overnight, the monopoly was broken at its roots. Billions of dollars in annual revenue and decades of control were suddenly at risk. But while Western governments and tech giants saw danger, elsewhere the mood was different. In South America, leaders watched closely. Countries long frustrated by foreign dependence began to whisper about their own continental networks. Brazil and Argentina quietly launched studies into whether an Internet of the South could follow Africa's blueprint. In Asia, where experiments with regional networks were already underway, the African model gave new legitimacy. Independence on this scale was no longer theory, it was reality. The reverberations were not only political, they were cultural. For years, the narrative of Africa had been shaped abroad, filtered through European textbooks and Western media. Now, with African data traveling on African cables, a new voice was rising. Students in Nairobi could search for their own history and see it written in their own languages. Entrepreneurs in Lagos could build apps without begging for space on foreign servers. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Africa was not asking for a seat at the table. It was building a table of its own. The global order felt the tremor. For some, it was frightening. For others, it was inspiring. In the streets of Ouagadougou, murals appeared with the words, "Our data, our destiny." Across Latin America, hashtags spread echoing Africa connected. Even in Asia, governments pointed to the African breakthrough as proof that sovereignty in the digital age was not only possible, but inevitable. What began as a regional rebellion had become a global conversation. The world was no longer asking if Africa could do it. The world was asking who would be next. Then came the moment that silenced even the loudest skeptics. The switch was flipped, the new African internet came alive, and within days more than 200 million people migrated onto the system. No platform in history, not Facebook, not TikTok, not WhatsApp, had ever witnessed adoption at this speed. What analysts once mocked as a dream had become unstoppable momentum. In Nairobi, the students streamed lectures without interruption for the first time in their lives. In Lagos, small businesses saved money instantly as payments no longer had to travel through European servers. In Ouagadougou, journalists searched in their native languages and saw African voices appear first, not buried beneath Western summaries. Ordinary people felt the difference immediately. Faster connections, lower costs, dignity restored. Across Silicon Valley, boardrooms were in crisis. Executives at Google and Microsoft held emergency meetings. They were not only losing users, they were losing control. The new African protocol was incompatible by design. Their algorithms could not crawl it. Their clouds could not dominate it. The monopoly was not challenged at the surface. It was broken at the root. At the same time, Western governments grew restless. Policymakers in Washington and Paris spoke of a splintered internet. Headlines warned of instability. Yet for Africans, the change was not chaos. It was liberation. It was the long-awaited proof that sovereignty could be coded into the very architecture of life. This was the climax, the turning point. For centuries, Africa had been a consumer, forced to rent, forced to obey. Now, for the first time, it had become a creator, an architect of its own destiny. The world had to face a new reality. Africa was no longer waiting at the back of the line. It was building the road ahead. Every revolution has its symbol, its banner, its phrase that condenses struggle into a heartbeat. For Africa's digital uprising, it was simple and powerful. Our hands, our life, our future. You could see it painted on walls in Ouagadougou, shared on banners in Nairobi, trending as hashtags from Lagos to Dakar. It was no longer just a slogan, it was proof. For the first time, sovereignty was not spoken, it was lived. The symbolism was everywhere. In a university library, students streamed African history lectures without buffering. In a small farming village, families no longer had to choose between groceries and internet fees for their children's education. In a hospital far from the capital, doctors could share patient data securely, without fear of surveillance from foreign servers. Each improvement seemed ordinary, but together they formed a new picture. Freedom made tangible. And yet the message ran deeper than cables and code. For centuries, Africa's wealth flowed outward. Gold, cocoa, oil, cotton, and now even data were siphoned away. But with the continental internet exchange, the flow reversed. Knowledge, money, and opportunity began circulating inward, building strength from within. The invisible resource of information was no longer escaping. It was staying home, nourishing African minds and African markets. The moral question was impossible to ignore. Why is self-reliance celebrated in America but questioned in Africa? Why is sovereignty praised in Europe but treated as reckless when demanded by Africans? Traore's challenge forced the world to confront its double standards. Independence is acceptable only when it does not threaten the old order. But Africa was no longer asking for permission. The payoff was more than economic. It was spiritual. It was the restoration of dignity. Africans were no longer passengers on someone else's network. They were drivers building roads of their own. In this moment, the symbolism echoed far beyond Africa. For older generations in America, it felt like the marches for civil rights. For Europeans, it resembled the fall of walls that once divided them. Different images, same heartbeat, people refusing to be defined by someone else's system. And so the moral crystallized into one truth. Sovereignty is not a gift. It is not a slogan. It is fiber. It is code. It is lived reality. And when a people sees it, the world must adjust. History is never written only by presidents or parliaments. It is written by witnesses, by ordinary people who choose to raise their voices when the tide begins to turn. Today, Africa stands at such a turning point. A continent that once rented its future has built its own foundation. A people once forced to obey distant algorithms now decide for themselves what they see, what they share, and what they build. But here is the truth. This story is not only Africa's. It belongs to all of us, because the same questions echo in every corner of the globe. Who controls your data? Who shapes the knowledge you consume? who decides what you pay just to stay connected. In an age of pandemics, cyber attacks, and financial shocks, sovereignty is no longer about borders on a map. It is about the invisible infrastructure of daily life, the cables under the oceans, the servers in distant cities, the code that decides what you see on your screen. If Africa can reclaim control, what excuse does the rest of the world have not to try? If a young leader in his mid-30s can stare down giants of Silicon Valley, then what can you and I do with the choices in front of us? So here is the call. If you believe this moment matters, do not stay silent. Press like, leave a comment, share this story. Let your voice travel further than any cable. Because the future is not given. The future is chosen.